In 1776, the British economist Adam Smith stated that China has been long one of the richest, that is, one of the most fertile, best cultivated, most industrious, and most populous countries in the world. It was true. China during the early 1800s was at its peak. It was larger than it had ever been. Its arts and culture flourished, and it was rich. But within a few decades, things went drastically wrong, and China became a weak, chaotic, and dysfunctional empire, spiraling into what Chinese historians have famously dubbed as the Century of Humiliation. So, what on earth happened? Well, opium happened. G'day everyone, welcome back to the Bamboo History Podcast. I'm your host Stephen, and yeah, it's good to be back after a bit of a break. For those who are new, the Bamboo History Podcast is a podcast that focuses on Chinese history, with a splash of history of neighbouring East Asian countries. If you like this type of content, then be sure to subscribe to this podcast to discover more exciting episodes. Today's episode will be about the First Opium War, the war that triggered China's downfall as a powerhouse and started the quote-unquote Century of Humiliation. Many of you probably know about this conflict already, but this episode will still be awesome because you'll be hearing it from me. So what are we waiting for? Let's get straight in to today's episode. The First Opium War was a war fought between the Qing Dynasty of China, Qing spelt Qing, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, between the years 1839 CE to 1842 CE. In Chinese, the conflict is known as the 第一次鸦片战争. For ease of reference throughout the episode, I will refer to both sides as China and Britain respectively. The first question we will need to explore is, what exactly caused the First Opium War? Most of you are probably thinking, Stephen, the war started because of opium. Duh! Well, this might come as a shock to you, but I believe the root of the war was based on something else entirely. And that was silver. If you tuned in to episode 39, you would know that China was the first to invent and print paper banknotes to use as currency, which they did so in the 11th century CE. However, in the 15th century, paper money was banned as a currency in China. Why? Because people started creating and circulating counterfeit money through the country, causing paper money to self-inflate and lose its value. Lack of modern technology meant it was a lot easier for people back then to produce fake money and get away with it. So from then on, China turned to silver as its main form of currency. But China's own silver reserves were low, so they had to get most of their silver through trade. Over the next few centuries, China would import heaps of silver, first from Japan, then from Spain, and then from other European countries. The European countries, led by Britain after the 1700s, wanted a lot of goods from China. In exchange for silver, the Europeans would get luxury items such as silk and porcelain. For the British in particular, they also wanted tea, which the Chinese had plenty of. Tea had been introduced to the Brits in the early 17th century and quickly became a favourite among the Brits, mainly because of its taste and associated health benefits. Initially, trade between China and the Europeans worked okay. Maritime trade in China was allowed in a few cities along the coastline in the Guangdong, Fujian, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu provinces, which started from the year 1685 CE. The biggest trading city would be Canton, spelt Canton, now known as the city of Guangzhou in the Guangdong province. Canton, as it was then called, was at the mouth of the Pearl River, which flowed into the South China Sea, and from there, endless opportunities of maritime trade. In Canton, most of the trade was conducted at a district called the 13 Factories, where foreigners would trade with a hong, or otherwise known as a hong spelt Hong. Hongs were licensed merchants who had an associated business and their own factory where they would operate their business. The British government, meanwhile, would utilize the British East India Company to conduct its trade in Asia. The British East India Company, or EIC for short, was a private corporation that had its headquarters in India, and unlike regular corporations, they had their own private army. So as the years rolled on, British desire for tea grew and grew. There were two problems though. The first was that, while the Brits and other Western countries wanted a lot of different Chinese goods, the Chinese only wanted silver. They weren't interested in anything else. The second was that the Chinese also began to feel a growing influence of Westerners in China through the increase in trade. And the Chinese government believed that the Western influence would destabilize the country. Hence, in 1757, the Qianlong Emperor ordered a ban in trade in all the Chinese ports, except for Canton. This policy was known as the Canton System. So now, if I was a foreigner, I wasn't allowed to trade in any other Chinese city. Canton was my only option. Oh no! Even within Canton, trade was restricted only to the 13 factories, and the trade was heavily supervised by the Cohong, spelt Cohong, or known in Chinese as Gonghang. The Cohong was a guild formed by the different Hongs at the behest of the Qing government. The British weren't happy about this and made requests to the Chinese to relax trading restrictions and the levies imposed on them. The most famous of these attempts was the Macartney Mission in 1793, which was Britain's first ever official diplomatic mission to China. King George III appointed Lord Macartney as ambassador to China, and he went directly to the Qianlong Emperor in Beijing to request the following things. 1. To open more ports for trade. 2. To reduce duties on imports. And 3. To increase imports from Britain to China. The mission was an epic failure for the British, as the Qianlong Emperor rejected all of their requests. The desire for Chinese tea and other goods was growing, but the Chinese weren't that interested in trade as much as the British. The British needed something else that the Chinese would have liked for trade. And that something else was opium. Some of you might be wondering, what is opium? Well, opium is a depressant drug that is extracted from the opium poppy flower. Inside the opium poppy pods, there is a milky substance called latex, not the latex some of you might be thinking about, that contains chemicals such as morphine and codeine. It is the latex that is extracted and then dried out to form opium. In Chinese, opium is known as鸦片, although during its existence it has had numerous nicknames. Opium first arrived in China during the Qing Dynasty in the 8th century CE, and was originally used for medicinal purposes, and used to treat all sorts of illnesses such as diarrhea, arthritis, diabetes, malaria, and even chronic coughs. It was initially eaten or drunk, and it could be prepared in many different ways and prepared alongside other ingredients. Licorice was one of them. So next time if you eat licorice and you're feeling a bit off, you know why. However, opium usage in China took a massive turn when something else called tobacco was also introduced into China sometime between the years 1573 to 1627. Smoking tobacco also led to the smoking of opium. And by the Qing Dynasty, the smoking of opium led to the widespread usage of opium amongst the commoners. And opium was no longer used medically, but was also used recreationally. This was because smoking could be done as a sociable activity, much like shisha smoking these days, and it was associated with status, and was also a lot less harmful than eating or drinking opium. Whilst opium usage was beneficial from a medical point of view, there were downsides to this drug that made it a problem. For one, opium generates nausea. It can create constipation if you take it without diarrhea. It also slows the brain centers that control your breathing, so you could die if you take too much of it. And it also heightens fear, paranoia, and schizophrenia. But the biggest problem of opium is that it is addictive, and many Chinese took to opium like wildfire. Initially though, the British hadn't thought about trading opium in China. This was because opium had been made illegal in 1729. But during the mid-1700s, the British East India Company, the EIC, waged wars against kingdoms in India and took over large swaths of their territory. It was these wars that cost the EIC a lot of money, more specifically a lot of silver, and because of that, they didn't have enough silver to trade with the Chinese. This, combined with the restriction of trade by Chinese authorities and the Chinese love for opium, made the Brits want to trade opium with the Chinese now. Especially when the EIC, the company, realised that they could import opium from India and then sell it in China for a large profit. But because the Chinese government had banned opium, because of its negative effects and the addiction it was causing, opium was smuggled into China and traded on the black market. The EIC, the British East India Company, would hire private traders called country traders, who would take the opium harvested in India to China, sell it to smugglers on the coast for gold or silver, then pass it on to the company, who would then use the same gold or silver to buy the goods they wanted from the official Chinese market, such as tea. To give you a bit of perspective, in 1729, only 200 chests of opium were imported annually into China. But by 1767, this number had skyrocketed to 1,000 chests, and between the years 1820 to 1830, an average of 10,000 chests per year of opium was being shipped to China. Even though it was illegal, the obsession of opium by the Chinese, added with the huge increases in opium shipped to China, meant that on a practical level, opium was being distributed to all corners of the country. It also didn't help that corrupt officials and military members would often aid smugglers in the distribution of opium. The Chinese government, under the Daoguang Emperor, eventually decided to crack down on the illegal opium trade. In 1838, he appointed Lin Zexu as the imperial commissioner to combat the growing threat of opium. Lin Zexu, spelt Linzexu, is a famous figure in Chinese history for his fight against opium, and was known as a morally upstanding and incorruptible government official. He arrived in Canton in 1839 and wrote a letter to Queen Victoria of Britain stating his opinion on opium. I'll read a part of this letter, which is as follows. We find your country is 60 or 70 li from China. Yet, there are barbarian ships that strive to come here for trade, for the purpose of making a great profit. The wealth of China is used to profit the barbarians. That is to say, the great profit made by barbarians is all taken from the rightful share of China. By what right do they then in return use the poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? Oh yeah, and I'm ethnically Chinese, so I think I'm okay to do a sort of fake Chinese accent like that, but if anyone's uncomfortable with it, let me know. Okay. No one is really sure if the Queen of Britain actually read the letter, but the letter written by Lin Zexu can be summarized as follows. Opium is a poison, tell those opium smugglers to bugger off, and I've come here to eradicate opium from our shores. In 1839, in Humen, a town on the banks of the Pearl River near Canton, Lin Zexu seized over 1,000 tons of illegal opium from British traders, and then in June began to destroy it all to the shock of the Western world. It took about 23 days to get rid of the entire lot. This event is known in Chinese history as Humen Xiaoyan, or destruction of opium in Humen. From a Chinese point of view, Lin Zexu is considered a national hero for destroying the opium and saving China from the poison. But from the British perspective, Lin Zexu was a villain who just completely, out of the blue, came out and destroyed their main item of trade with the Chinese. Just like that. The destruction of all that opium at once angered those British merchants, and they wanted justice, and above all, compensation. These merchants sought the help of a William Jardine, who was a merchant that had led illegal opium trading operations in China. William Jardine had connections in the British government that he used to try and convince the government to take action to right the quote-unquote wrongs of what Lin Zexu had done to them. So, what did the British government decide to do? Well, what happened next would change the course of history forever. And, but wait, but to hear what happened next, you gotta stay tuned for next week's episode and part 2 of the First Opium War. Got you all, psych. Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode. Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, and see you all next week on the Bamboo History Podcast. Bye for now.